about the way I've lived a life a drifter, waiting for the day when I take your hand and sing your songs, and maybe you would say, come lay with me and love me, and I would surely stay.
There has been a rock movement in India for long, unbelievingly as long as from the 1960s. These pictures are from the 60s, a time that probably gave birth to India's first rock band. In 1968, a band called the Great Bear was formed in the Park Street of Kolkata.
When Sgt. Pepper's the Beatles' most creative and musically interesting album came out, I was already hanging around on Park Street, and Trinkers was a restaurant where the young kids would go on Sundays for 4 hours. There would be a jam session and all the hits would be played by very, very good bands. The other very important thing was the standard of musicianship of the local musicians was very high.
Indian rockers did not have a great time dealing with society. For the society, they were a useless bunch of rebellious drug addicts, like anywhere else in the world.
I know my friend was a sales executive with Metal Box and Company, and they looked down on the fact that he was in a rock and roll band.
A big movement in the West was leading musicians to become peace activists. This was a time when the scene in India had just begun. Woodstock 1969 was not a huge impact on Indian bands.
We were aware of the protest against violence, and we shared the same thoughts, but the way it was politicized in the West, it was not to that extent over here. We still considered Bob Dylan as a guru of music and not of social change.
Interestingly, by the 1970s, rock concerts and competitions made way in India. A magazine called Junior Statesman began organizing rock and roll concerts and gigs around the country.
This magazine organized a beat contest. The finals were held in Chennai, and we won it. And somewhere there is a picture of Mr. Amitabh Bachchan giving us the prize. I don't know where it is, but it's there.
By then there were many Indian rock and roll bands. To name a few, High from Kolkata, The Great Society from Shillong, People from Mumbai, and a band called Shiva that came along to be known as one of the most touring bands in India. That period was what we know as the acid era. Long hair and carefree attitude. Drugs began to define the sound of music.
The influences did come, into us, like brown sugar, acid, charas, grass as we call it also. And at that time, you're young, you're really not educated, or your parents don't know, that this is right and that is wrong. And for us, it was like a, it was like an experience. Okay, these guys are doing it, so we should do it too.
The acid era began affecting the sound of Indian rock as well. Distortion and psychedelic music came in like a piercing needle. Distortion was in the air.
Distortion, yes, you're absolutely correct. There were people, companies started manufacturing the wah and, the distortion. And then they sort of got into better sounds, like maybe distortion, but maybe a distortion with a compressor, maybe just a sound which is slightly, is not a clean song.
Because of drugs, many musicians ended their careers with a high. The only difference, it was a high of a different type.
Just let me move.
Know you when you're walking on the floor. Know you when you're walking to the door. Know you when you're driving your car.
On the other hand, Bob Dylan's influence was growing in India by the day. It was in that period when Lou Major, the frontman of the Great Society, decided to celebrate Bob Dylan's birthday every year. Until date, the man taps his foot on Dylan's music. Interestingly, he also credits Bob Dylan for his life.
I wanna feel so all alone.
With love, respect for the man who has given so much to the world.
There came about many a bands by the early 80s. The acid era seemed to have ended. Five young guys in Mumbai with spunk in their attitude saw a difference and formed Rock Machine. Rest became history.
Watching rockers on my home screen every day. Rags to riches, the rock and roll way. The pain seemed like so much fun now that he's on top. All you gotta do is knuckle down and give it all you got. He's on top.
Luckily for us, in a way, that era was over, you know. So we were, I think, more a drinking band rather than a druggy band in any way.
Never gonna give it up. Oh yeah. Mansions and limousines.
Rock Machine was originally Rock and Roll Machine. The incident that led the band to be named as Rock Machine and not Rock and Roll Machine speaks volumes about the monetary circumstances of Indian rock bands at that time.
Roll one. Turned out that the guys on top, they had all the fun.
The talent was there, but money wasn't.
Top of the rock, and they know just how to live it up.
There was an organizer who wanted to do a show for the band, and he said, and I think there was no name, so they said, "You got to have a name, I need to put something on the poster." So there was an album that everyone was fond of, I think it was called Rock and Roll Machine or something, and they said, "All right, the band is called Rock and Roll Machine." So he says, "Okay," and then 2-3 days later he comes back with a small little poster and he says, "Look guys, I don't have too much money and Rock and Roll Machine isn't going to fit on the poster, so I've just put Rock Machine." So everyone said, "Hey, but you know, we had decided on Rock and Roll Machine." He said, "I'm sorry, if you want to do the show, it's Rock Machine." So that's how the name came by, and it stuck for a long time.
By the late 80s, new sounds were explored in India. Heavy metal began making its way in the country. And their inspirations were bands like Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath, and not the Beatles. They believed in original music. Playing covers was no longer a cool thing. It's the original attitude that mattered.
I think a pop musician, I think he's going to get scared by experimenting with something on stage because he's used to the acclaim and the admiration, the affection of his listeners and his audience. A jazz musician, a hard rock musician never really gets scared because they're used to people saying like, what are you doing? You're playing nonsense, I'm not interested in it. So we were used to it, you know, we were prepared for it, and in fact we were surprised when it started working. We did it because we believed in it. We were angry young people, we had a lot to say, we had a lot to shout about, a lot to be angry about.
In 1988, Millennium, headed by the then long-haired Vernon Ibrahim, released the first album on an audio cassette. First by any Indian rock band.
Took our money that we got from gigs, and that was a theme, I mean, that we followed throughout the band's life. Took our money from gigs, went to the studio, spent a week there, recorded, mostly night times, because that's when you get the cheap hours. So it would start at 7, 8 in the evening. Somebody would bring biryani or something at around 11 o'clock at night. Would run out of water, we'll have to drink from the tap and stuff like that. And around 4 or 5 in the morning, then we'll plod off home, you know, our ears ringing from the sound, and we'll start again the next night. That for 10, 15 days, then would end up with a tape. And those days there was no digital recordings.
The same year, Rock Machine started enjoying tremendous success with their great showmanship. Rock was growing in the country like never before.